So the question which we have today, which was on the headline of this topic, which is really a continuation of Jewish status questions. How can there be an impediment within marriage once you know that both the bride and the groom are both Jewish? The question was, I was born out of wedlock. What is my status? So I've began to hint on the answer last week when I said that there are two main categories of forbidden relationships. One of them is called, which we spoke about last time, psuli chitn, which means forbidden marriages, or as we mentioned, they're called isure lav, negative commandments. And the other ones were a step further. They're called isure arayos, which we translated as illicit relationships. And those illicit relationships are defined in the Torah, but they're always defined in the Bible, but always explained in the oral Torah and Talmud and the codes. In normal vernacular, we would describe them as incest and adultery, which means incest is unlawful familial relationships, and adultery means basically cheating on marriage. That's how it's defined in human language, in a society we live in. There's also other forbidden relationships mentioned in a Torah, and we know that Hashem made them and not human beings. So today it's very politically incorrect to mention some of them, but we know that the Bible, you can't wipe away what it says in the Torah and in God's law, and this is a prohibition against same gender relationships. There's also laws of nida, laws of mikveh, which are included in arayos. But with all of them, which are able to produce children, obviously same gender relationships can produce children, but all of them, with exception of nida is one exception, doesn't produce a mamzer. The result of a arayos, of these illicit relationships, incest, adultery, that it also affects children. And a mamzer is not somebody that, as described in the common society, somebody born out of wedlock. That's the question I was asked. There are many people who come from all kinds of backgrounds. The parents had civil marriages. The parents had non-halachic weddings. As long as everything else is right, as long as they are permitted to each other, they can always, it's definitely a very, very important part of our spiritual and divine system for Jewish people to sanctify the marriage by having a chuppah. As we say, Kedas Moshe v'Yisrael, according to the law of Moses and Israel, but that can be rectified, that can be corrected. But as long as the couple was permitted to each other, the children are kosher, and the whole concept of being born out of wedlock doesn't exist as a stigma and as a something which makes somebody disqualified from being married. It doesn't exist in Jewish law. So that is a quick answer to that particular question. Before we get into the most usual question of a mamzer, I want to tell you that some of them are not so well known, some of the definitions of incest. For example, the Torah says that if a man marries a woman under a chuppah, so her sister becomes a erva to him. She becomes forbidden even if he divorces his wife. That once he married a woman and this woman is alive, even if he divorces her, then having a relationship with a sister on any level, there's no marriage in illicit relationships. Like we said last time, it doesn't click, it doesn't, no marriage can make it a marriage, no ceremony can make it a marriage. So if somebody, whether has a ceremony or without a ceremony, that's called one of the illicit relationships, and the child is a mamzer. If, God forbid, the wife dies, then it's totally permissible to marry his sister. But if one divorces her, then it's actually one of the most severe prohibitions, the same as any other incestual relationships. And as a matter of fact, I want to share with you that one of the most dramatic stories of Mamzerus, of a status of Mamzer, which was very, very, well known in the rabbinic circles in Israel, was such a story of children born from a woman when the father was married previously to her sister. And the story was like this: there was a young man living in Morocco, and they sort of matched him off at the young age of 15. It's a very usual thing in those days in Morocco to marry very young. And he married a girl who was probably around the same age as him. The shidduch didn't work out, and they got divorced. They get according to Jewish law. He moved to Israel and to the city of Tzfat. He became a contractor, a developer, and he went to the rabbinate to marry a young lady. Somehow in those days, it was a bit of a beginning of the rabbanut's work, and they didn't ask the right questions on the questionnaire. There was no computers in those days. Somehow they didn't realize that in Morocco he was married to the sister of this girl, and they approved the marriage, and he was married to her, and they had 9 kids, 9 children. And it was a religious family. They moved to the city of Beersheba, south of Israel. And when the oldest son was studying in the yeshiva, he started to read both in the written Torah, in the oral Torah, and he came to realize, they always knew that the father was married to their aunt before. But they didn't realize there was a lot of terrible, terrible consequences and repercussions. And so he started to ask questions. They went to the Beth Din. The head of the Beth Din in Beersheba was a very great scholar, a very close friend of mine actually. His name is Rabbi Eliyahu Abargel. And what can you do? It's really a black and white case. There's no room to find leniency. So in Israel, they have something called a high court, a high rabbinic court in Jerusalem. And he sent it off there. He sent it off to the high court. And I believe Rabbi Vadi Yosef was involved, and they also didn't find any solution to the problem. And the case went back to Beersheba. So that's what happens when the High Court doesn't want to appeal, doesn't want to overturn the ruling. It goes back to the original court. And basically, there was no way they could make the children not mamzerim. And a mamzer, as I mentioned last week, it's a terrible thing because on one hand, there's no stigma on a personal level. The person is not being somehow disrespected or disadvantaged. But the mamzer cannot marry into the mainstream Jewish community. It's very limited who he can marry. And even those that he can marry, the children continue to be mamzerim. And it's irrelevant whether it's on the men's side, whether it's a boy is a mamzer or a girl is a mamzer. It continues, unfortunately, l'olam void, forever and ever. And while the whole thing was happening, and they were going to, nobody rushes to proclaim somebody mamzer. There's always an attempt to find a solution, which I'll talk about soon, what solutions exist under other circumstances. But in the meantime, a mother of the 2 sisters arrives, a Moroccan lady, elderly lady, and she says that she adopted one of the girls. They're not natural sisters, not biological sisters. One girl is her daughter, and the other one was adopted. So that would solve the whole problem. Now the Rabbi Bargel, he later on became what's called a Raivad. He became the head of all the rabbinic courts in Jerusalem. And so he took a telephone book. Nobody knows today what a telephone book is, doesn't exist anymore. But he took a telephone book and he wrapped it up in a newspaper, which also doesn't exist today. And he said to her, I'd like you to swear on the Holy Zohar. This is the Holy Zohar. I'd like you to swear that you tell me the truth. So she swore. She thought it was the Holy Zohar. Zohar is a book of Kabbalah written by the famous rabbi 2,000 years ago called Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, whose Yom Tov was celebrated today like Ba'omer. It's the most fundamental book on Jewish mysticism. So she swore on a telephone book, thinking that it's book of Kabbalah, saying yes, one of the daughters is adopted. So there was already great happiness, and they thought that they found a solution. And before the whole verdict, the whole psak din, the ruling was written, she comes back a few weeks later, maybe a month later. She says, Rabbi, since I swore in a holy Zohar, terrible things, I swore falsely, terrible things are happening to me. There's sicknesses in the family, there's all kinds of accidents. I came to confess that it wasn't true. So all of this, unfortunately, didn't. The solution didn't come through at the end. Now I'm going to tell you later on, in order to, maybe at the end of the lecture, what was the final outcome, for a reason. Because in order to understand, we have to a little bit see how a Mamzer's cases, the cases that come to court of illegitimate status, how are they, what attempts are made in order to solve the problem. So we'll talk about it. That's the main part of the shir today. We'll also discuss the whole foundation of a Jewish marriage today, what it's all about. The most common case that we have today of a question of a mamzer comes to a beis din. It's a question of a adultery. When there's a married woman who has a child with another man. What does it mean? What does adultery mean? Adultery in English means a lot of things, but in the Torah it has a very specific definition. Adultery means that when there's a man and a woman had a marriage, Kedas Moshe v'Yisrael, according to the law of Moses and Israel, halachic marriage. This marriage can only be broken when this particular event occurs. It's not a ceremony. It's a divine process by which a bond is created. And it's such a powerful bond that Hashem himself becomes part of it. And the only thing that can break this particular bond is two things. Either death of one of the partners or a get. A get is not a regular divorce. It's a divorce according to Jewish law, which is a very, it disappeared. Everything disappeared. Everybody can hear me? Oh. No? Yeah. So the only thing that can break this particular bond, which is called the Jewish marriage, is either death of one of the partners or a get. A get is a very, very specialized procedure. Only qualified judges of the Beth Din are allowed to officiate it at a get, as opposed to marriage, which a lot of rabbis can be qualified. And only a get made under all of the rules of the Torah and the Talmud and the Code of Jewish law, that could dissolve the marriage. However, we have to know that sometimes a get is needed even when the marriage is not fully in accordance with Jewish law, which I'll explain in a moment. So if a marriage took place and a woman has a child with another man, it doesn't matter whether she cheated on him, whether they're already divorced civilly. It doesn't matter that they're not living together already with a husband for 10 or 20 years. If there was no get, this is called adultery if she has relationship with another man. And if that other man is Jewish, then the child is a mamzer. If the man is not Jewish, it's still adultery, but the child is not a mamzer. It's interesting that that's how it's defined. So the traditional cases that existed in the Talmud was when the husband would go away on a trip, or he would go to war and he wouldn't come back, then he needed a witness to be able to set the wife free. If he disappeared and nobody knows where he is, she's an aguna. Aguna means a woman, on one hand, she doesn't have a husband because he disappeared. But if we don't know that he died and there was no get, she cannot remarry and she can't have children with anybody else. That is the definition of adultery. Now I know that in the conventional language, adultery is any kind of cheating. So for example, if a man cheats on his wife in Jewish law, it's reprehensible and it's totally forbidden. But when it comes to a biblical adultery which causes a child to be Mamzer, is specifically when a woman has a relationship, extramarital relationship. And the reason why biblically that's the case, because we know that in the Bible there was permissibility to marry, for one man to marry more than one wife. We had many examples. We had example of Jacob, we had examples of King David, King Solomon, and so on and so forth. It was allowed. But at the same time, it was never ever allowed for women to have two husbands. And that is why it's considered to be adultery. So what exactly is a halachic marriage? A halachic marriage is when a chuppah takes place, there are two witnesses, two kosher witnesses, and the groom places a ring on the finger of his bride. He says those words, Harei at mikudeshes li b'tabah zokidas Moshe v'Yisrael. You are sanctified to me, to be my wife, according to laws of Moses in Israel. And today it's only done with the rabbi because there's many, many laws how to make it kosher. And that's how a woman becomes married to a man and a man becomes married to a woman, and they can only be broken with a get. There was a very great argument among scholars if a non-halachic marriage took place, can one still marry someone else without a get? In other words, is the get still needed? And the reason for the argument was as follows. The Talmud says that biblically there are three ways to marry a woman. One way is with a ring, which is called kesef, through a monetary object, an object of value. Another way is cohabitation, by living together, having in mind that you are sanctifying her by living together. And the third way was through a document, not a ksuba, not a marriage document we have today, but a separate document which she gave her instead of a ring. At a certain stage, the rabbis have decreed, it was approximately 1600 years ago, I would say, it was decreed by rabbis that today you can only, from that point on, only marry with a object, with a kesef, like with a ring, for example, or a similar object. And for the last hundreds of years, it became specifically a ring for certain reasons. So the argument is, even though you're not allowed to marry any other way except for the ring, but what if you're living together, you're married civilly? Could this be considered a biblical marriage, and therefore it needs a divorce? And here there was an argument which spanned many generations. It began approximately 850 years ago with the Rambam, Maimonides, who argued that there's no need in such a case, or at least that's how he is understood. In this day and age, today, in the 20th century, there were two great scholars. One was called Moshe Feinstein, who passed away in 1986. He lived in America, New York. He was one of the most prolific and profound halachic decisors. And at the same time, there was another American rabbi. They both came from Russia. And they both sort of, I'm sure they didn't speak English well, but they lived in America in the second part of their life. And they had a very, very famous argument, which was recorded in their books. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein said that being that today, and he brought a lot of scholarly arguments, being that today nobody marries any other way except through a ceremony with a ring and everything else, a kosher ceremony, therefore anybody who does otherwise, it's not considered to be for the sake of marriage, it's for the sake of Jewish marriage. The husband doesn't have a mind to sanctify his wife in such a way. Rabbi Henkin, on the other hand, his colleague, argued differently. He said, even though it's not a kosher marriage, if you marry civilly or Reform, non-Orthodox, then it's considered to be while it's not a kosher marriage and you should rectify it and marry properly, but it's strong enough to require a get. And the consensus among almost all of the judges and halachic decisors that from the letter of the law we don't require a get. We try always to do a get because it's the most severe situation to allow a woman without a get to marry somebody else. But whenever possible, we will do it. But if it's difficult, or the husband is not cooperating, or the husband is not to be found, or even in a situation where she wants to marry a Kohen, where a get could be problematic for her, in all these cases, we would allow her to marry without a get. But one thing is for sure, we would never ever make a Mamzer as a result of a lack of a get, lack of a divorce, when there was no kosher marriage in the first place. In order for there to be a Mamzer, there has to be a kosher marriage, Orthodox marriage. Why is Reform or conservative marriage not considered to be kosher? It's very simple. Because all the other movements, they deny the most profound foundation of the Torah, that these laws are not man-made, they are divine, and therefore all of the ceremonies that are made by non-Orthodox celebrants, they're exactly what they are, the ceremonies. It's not this spiritual bond which is created. So therefore, there would be no Mamzer if there was no kosher marriage. So what happens in a situation where a question of Mamzer comes up? It usually happens as a result of lack of knowledge. People don't know, they're not taught that if you get married, and God forbid you have to get divorced, you have to have a get. I always tell rabbis, make sure that you conduct premarital classes, and make sure that part of the classes should be what is a chuppah and the meaning behind what the couple is about to embark on, and what happens as a result of this so-called ceremony, what sort of bond is created, and the consequences if there is a divorce without a get, a separation without a get. So once the couple is taught, usually it would alleviate the vast amount of the Mamzer cases. Almost every case of a Mamzer that comes our way is when the woman didn't know. They got divorced civilly. She went ahead and married another man, either civilly or in a Reform marriage. And she didn't realize what impact it'll make on her child. And when this happens, what are the possible solutions to the problem? So the first thing that we look at is to really see if the marriage was a kosher marriage in order to be able to find a solution. You'll see how much effort goes in to find a solution for Mamzerim. As much as the Torah has this law created by God Himself about the effect that adultery has on a child, at the same time, the Torah itself gives us means and ways and different solutions to be able to solve the problem. So, one particular case that we had, I'm going to share a couple of cases with you. It was something like in 2002. It came from Melbourne. There was a couple of siblings who wanted to get married, and the rabbis in Melbourne found out that the grandmother was married under a chuppah in Sydney, Australia, in approximately 1937, before the war. The marriage was very, very bad. He was abusive, he was violent. Because of him, she had a few miscarriages and ended up in separation. She never got a get. She married in a Reform marriage, and she had one daughter, and now the daughter's children are seeking permission to get married. After doing a lot of research, what we found was, in those days, and we had a rabbi who was actually who testified to us, that the witnesses who conducted the wedding in those days, we're talking about Australia in 1937, and the religious standard was very, very low. So even the reverend, he was like the assistant of the rabbi who conducted the ceremony, he wasn't a qualified witness because he wasn't an observant person. He used to drive or used to use a transport to the synagogue on Shabbos. In those days probably was some kind of a subway or train or whatever they had in 1937, but he didn't, he was a Shabbos violator. And Shabbos violator is not a kosher witness according to Jewish law. It has to be a person who observes the commandments. And we also had testimony about the other witnesses. So even though it was officially an Orthodox marriage, but you can see that once there was no kosher witnesses present at all, it certainly wouldn't affect the child to be a mamzer. Another interesting nuance about the prohibition of a mamzer is that the Torah and the Talmud give us rules that if you have enough doubts about it, you can take away the stigma of a mamzer. In other words, if you know for sure somebody is a mamzer, there's no other way to be able to interpret where he comes from. You know exactly who his father is. You know exactly with whom she had the child. The classical case of mamzer that you really couldn't solve was in olden times when a woman's husband went away. She thought he was dead. She married another man, and then the husband came back. In such a case, you know exactly who she married. You know exactly what happened. You know exactly that she never got a get, and that is the hardest case to solve. But if you have a situation when a woman just had a child with somebody, then you would go by majority of people living in a particular country. So you're living in Australia and America, you would say, how do we know she had a child with a Jew? Maybe he wasn't a Jew. And once the father of the child is not Jewish, the child cannot be a mamzer. This is just on a very simplified way to see how we would, what arguments we would use. Every time there was a mamzer case, there has to be a case written down. There has to be a thesis of arguments, of Talmudic sources, halachic sources. It's not a simple process. But I must say that in virtually all the cases that we had, we're able to solve the problem. I would say that we had approximately close to 100 files of mamzeres, and 3 of them are not yet solved. Maybe they won't be solved, I don't know, but they at the moment they are still pending. But in most cases, there's an ability to find a solution. It doesn't mean that in any way that adultery becomes somehow, God forbid, more permissible. Adultery is still adultery. But as far as the stigma on the child, we do everything possible. We leave no stone unturned not to find a solution. I was asked by a certain rabbi, maybe it's a good idea to be able to make a wedding not kosher. So when a rabbi marries somebody, don't have kosher witnesses. So later on, if something happens with a mamzer, you'll be able to solve the problem. So this question has to be addressed because nothing good comes out of being dishonest. And one thing which we teach rabbis is that everything that you do has to be transparent and very clear. An Orthodox wedding has to be under the strictest laws of Halacha, of Jewish law. If it's a non-Orthodox wedding, don't try to make it kosher. Sometimes I was asked, by certain religious people who's in America, where there's a very strong Reform movement, non-Orthodox movement. And they were saying, my cousin is getting married, Reform. Can we plant kosher witnesses? So I told them that you have to make sure the witnesses are as unkosher as possible. Because once you will start to distort the clarity of a situation, you're asking for trouble. Everybody knows it's a Reform marriage. There is the Reform Ksuba, there's a video of a Reform ceremony. Some years down the line, it could be that a married woman, if you will plant kosher witnesses, and there's a question that maybe this woman is now married according to Halacha, and she requires a get. Later on, this woman may be allowed to marry without a get because nobody will know about this witnesses planted in the audience. Maybe you'll make a wrong ruling as a result of it. So there's always has to be a very great amount of clarity. Orthodox weddings have to be done according to Jewish law, and if it's something not Orthodox, don't try to make it Orthodox. If somebody wants to get married reform, you have to explain to them that why it's wrong, or why it's not a sanctified marriage. But at the same time, if you can convince them to go halachic and to do it properly, do it. But if not, don't mix the two together. Don't make a double ceremony which has both factors in it. We have a very, very strong question that is always asked today. Why a difference between men and women? And why a woman can be an aguna and she can be denied a get from her husband, and the Torah allows for the possibility of holding somebody hostage? And is it the same for men as for women? Is there equality in that particular issue, that particular situation? A number of years ago, there was a story that hit the public media, became very famous, went viral, as I say, to the extent that I was asked to comment on it. There was a member of a very famous rabbinic family in America, and he was refusing his wife a get. And she went to Facebook and the public media, she spoke about it, and the whole world was discussing it, how terrible it is that this man comes from such a important family. How is it possible? How could a Torah allow for his wife to be a hostage and not to be granted a get, without which she cannot get on with her life? Ultimately, she received the get. But until it happened, it was justifiably, it was a subject of a lot of discussion. So I was asked to write a comment on it. And I wrote in very short the following. After I explained what actually happens when a bride and a groom stand under a chuppah and are married, Kedas Moshe v'Yisrael, according to the law of Moses in Israel, what sort of bond is created and what can actually break the bond, I explained that this is a divine law. It's not a law made by man. Hashem himself said that in order for this woman to be free, she has to be able to, either the husband has to die, or they have to have a get. One of the two. There was actually an interesting story that happened, a true story, that happened in the 19th century. There was two great rabbis. They were the giants of that generation. One was called Rabbi Akiva Eger, and one was called the Chassam Sofer. Chassam Sofer was the chief rabbi of Preshburg, today called Bratislava, and he actually became the son-in-law of Rabbi Akiva Eger. And after the wedding, when he married Rabbi Akiva Eger's daughter, he was sitting with his father-in-law, watching him presiding in judgment over different cases. And one day, an incredible story happened. The story happened that a woman comes in and says, Rabbi, I don't know what to do. I was married to Jewish men. I have 7 kids. I'm only 34 years old. My husband, something happened to him. He converted to Christianity. He married a Christian woman. He doesn't want to give me a get. He went on with his life and I'm stuck. I don't know what to do. So Rabbi Akiva Eger, he told his secretary of the Beth Din, he said, summon that man, tell him to come to the Beth Din, and probably he will not agree to come because he doesn't respect Jewish law. So call his bluff. Tell him that he's probably scared to come. So to show you that he's not scared, he will come. The man came. He came in a very arrogant fashion. He didn't cover his hair, his head. He came smoking. His whole demeanor was very, very disrespectful. So Rabbi Akiva Eger tried to talk to him nicely. He said to him, why don't you give a get to your wife? So he said, look, I don't believe in this law. I think that it's primitive, and therefore I want nothing to do with it. I don't have to participate in all of these rituals. I'm a Christian man. I have nothing to do with Judaism. So Rabbi Akiva Eger told him, he said, listen, you went on with your life. For you it's not important, for her it's important. It'll take you a few minutes. We'll call the scribe, we'll call the witnesses, you'll appoint them, we'll do everything without you, we'll do by proxy. But you must do at least the very, very minimal appointments for us to free her. Why do you want to ruin her life? You went on with your life. So he said, because on principle, I don't believe in it, and I don't want to do any part with any Jewish ritual. So Rabbi Akiva Eger saw that there's nobody to talk to. So he changed his tune and he said to him, listen, when you were young, did you study in the yeshiva? He said, yes. Did you learn the first Mishnah in the tractate? Mishnah was the original work of the oral Torah, of the tractate dealing with marriages. The very first Mishnah, the very first law says that biblically a man could marry his wife in 3 ways. We mentioned this before. With a monetary object, with cohabitation, and a document. But she can be free in 2 ways. Either death of a husband or a divorce. And Rabbi Akiva Eger said to him, so which one do you want? The Mishnah says that, the 2 ways, so you have to choose between the 2 of them. So it took the guy a couple of seconds to realize, like the coin dropped, what the rabbi is saying, and he got very angry, and he said, are you trying to threaten me? Are you trying to somehow to pressure me? And he got very, very angry, and he came out of the room, and he slammed the door, and Rabbi Akiva Eger told everybody, just be quiet, open the door, and see what happens. They opened the door, and the man, as he was walking out, he had a major, major heart attack, and he passed away on the spot. He died on the spot. So obviously, he chose that particular way. He could have given the get. The rabbi gave him a choice. But this story teaches us not everybody can do it. I tried, it doesn't always work. But one thing which we learn from this story, that we don't tolerate using religion to have control, blackmail, extortion, revenge. It's not on. But you can't blame an institution because somebody takes advantage of it. We know that there are very many very worthy institutions. Institutions of parenthood, parents and kids, teachers and students, doctors and patients. And very often, unfortunately, the more powerful party of that particular institution takes advantage of the other one. The parents who abuse the kids, the teachers who abuse the students, and so on and so forth. It doesn't mean that the institution of parenthood is bad and should be abolished. It means that we shouldn't tolerate using that particular place that you have an institution to be able to control and somehow abuse other people. So that's what I wrote in my article. I said that, we can't change the law, but we have to do everything possible to be able to fight it. So we had a case over here in Australia. I'm changing the facts and everything else. There was a young couple that were married overseas, and for work purposes they're married in the States, and for work purposes they came to Australia, and they started a family. They had 2 children, and at a certain point the marriage broke irrevocably. Something major happened. It went to court. There were certain very strong allegations, and the wife came over to me and said, look, I really want to get. We contacted the husband, and the husband started to tell us. He was very, very polite, but he wasn't forthcoming. He said, I'll give a get, but right now it's in court. If you take it out of court and you take it to the Beth Din, then I'll give a get. Well, it's in court, wait till the court is over. So we explained to him that we can't take it out of court because right now there are certain allegations to do with safety of children, and the courts can protect them. So we cannot take it out of court. But at the same time, we told him that we can't wait till the end of the court case. Could last, who knows, it could last for years. So he was procrastinating. He would never said no, but it was just schlepping on and on and on. And the woman was begging for a get. So at one point we called the both to the Beth Din, And we asked each one to speak. We asked her to explain what she wants and him to respond. So she says that the marriage broke down. It's not in any way, there's no chance for the marriage to be mended and to be restored. And therefore she wants the get. The husband was saying that he will give a get very politely, but he wants to wait until all the proceedings are over. The ruling was, at the end, after we heard both, we didn't give him the ruling on the spot. We told the husband that he must give a get as soon as the civil divorce comes through, which was in a couple of months. We said if the civil divorce is not waiting for the court cases to finish, certainly the get doesn't have to wait for this to finish. So we ruled that he should give her a get. So he told us that his rabbi in America is telling him to wait. We contacted the rabbi in America, and he said to us, no, he would always cooperate. He would never tell him to go against the Beth Din. Then he started to blame Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who was the great deceased scholar in America, wasn't alive anymore, telling us that this rabbi ruled that you have to wait till the end of the proceedings in court until you grant the get. And we explained to him very politely that he shouldn't tell the Beth Din. We know better than him what Moshe Feinstein is saying, and he must give the get. When we saw, after the civil divorce came through, we saw that his get wasn't coming, we announced all around the community that this person's not giving get to his wife, and therefore he had certain amount of networking in the religious community. He was able to, he prayed in the synagogue. He was a guest in many homes, and we said that this all has to stop. He cannot get called up to a Torah. He can't have any honors in the synagogue. People can't invite him, and so on and so forth. Within 2 weeks, he came and he gave a get. So even though ultimately the law says that a husband has to give the get willingly, but he can be pressured. When the Beth Din can see the time to give a get and he doesn't want to give it, there are many pressures that could be applied. The question is, again, is it only the women who are agunas? What about men? The same law applied to one to the other. Can a woman also hold a man in ransom? So the first answer is that it's wrong both ways. You can't justify one or the other. We have approximately the same amount of men who deny or make it difficult for the wives to get a get as the other way around, as women denying the get, accepting the get from the husband. Now, it's true that biblically there is a difference, and as a result there are more solutions for men. Approximately 1,000 years ago, there was a great rabbi. One of the lectures I'm going to explain the structure of the Jewish law. It's very important to understand that it's not just some kind of a system without any structure. It's a very, very solidly and intricately structured system that has a very strong logic to it. All of the rabbinic legislations that were legislated until the Talmud was completed, approximately 4th century, the end of 4th century, they are binding to all Jews. But all of the legislations that came afterwards, because there was a decentralization, there wasn't anymore one court that controlled everything. There was already separation between Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardi Jews and so on and so forth. So legislations happened, but they weren't all encompassing. They weren't all obligating to all the Jews. So there was a rabbi in Ashkenazi countries. His name was Rabbi Gershon, and him and his court made a number of legislations. One legislation is that a woman cannot be forced. She also has to agree to a get, just like a man biblically has to agree to give a get to his wife. He made a legislation that a woman has to agree to accept the get. Now, this legislation was made universally for Ashkenazim and Sephardim. They all accepted it. Another legislation that he made was that a man cannot marry more than one wife. Until the time, it was allowed. It was very, very uncommon. You look in all the rabbis in the Talmud, you don't see anybody with two wives. It wasn't a common phenomena in the Jewish life, but it was allowed. Rabbeinu Gershon, he forbade it, for Ashkenazi Jews at least. It became a custom in many other countries, but for Ashkenazi Jews it became like a cherem, like a very, very strong law. And therefore, a man also needs to get a get, and he also can't force his wife to accept the get. However, to be truthful and to be honest, there are more solutions for men than for women. For women, precisely because biblically, bigamy and polygamy was allowed, and therefore already here we have a number of mechanisms that can be put through in order to make sure that a man doesn't remain, so to speak, trapped into marriage that he doesn't want. Over here we have to be very careful to see when it could be applied and when it can be applied. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the methods that could be used is a method called zikui, which means to merit somebody with a get. And that's one of the solutions which men have, which women don't have. So for example, if you have a situation when a woman is out of control or revenge or hatred, doesn't want to accept the get, but she herself moved on, she is not religious, so she decided to marry somebody else, Jewish, non-Jewish, civilly. Obviously she couldn't marry under chuppah, but she is getting on with her life. And her husband is a religious man, and he can't get on with his life because he is he needs a get, and he can't get married without a get. So over here we could apply something called zikui. Because a woman is living in an adulterous relationship every second of her life, the court can grant a divorce which the husband will give over to a shliach, to an agent, who will accept it on behalf of the woman as a zchus, as a merit for her. It's something good for her, something which is, for her, it's very, very severe to be living this way. And that's called get al zikui. You can only do it if you know for sure that she is living it. If somebody comes with a rumor and telling you that something about her, it's not good enough. But if you know that she's either married or she's in an open relationship, that could be done. That's one particular method that could be used. Having said that, we have to be. Or another example is when a woman herself initiates a civil divorce, so she shows that she wants to get divorced, and after divorce is granted, she doesn't want to accept the get. Again, usually it's done just out of spite. In such a case, you also could grant a get zikui to merit her, because obviously she wants to be divorced from him. She initiated the civil divorce. Even in such cases, we're always very careful to make sure that the reason why a woman doesn't want to accept the get is purely for control purposes, revenge, blackmail, and so on and so forth. If it's because she's looking for protection, we'll always make sure that she's protected. I'm going to give you one example. We had a case many years ago that a couple scheduled a get in the Beth Din, and only he arrived. She didn't come. So because the scribe and the witnesses were there, so we wrote the get, but we couldn't hand it over, so we appointed an agent. So when she's ready to come, she'll come and she'll be able to accept the get. So we called her and we asked her, why don't you come? So she said that they have children together, and the children go to a very expensive Jewish private school, and the husband doesn't want to participate at all in paying for school fees, and all she's asking for is for him to sit at a table and discuss it. She's not trying to extort him or to blackmail him. She's asking just to have a normal discussion about it, to come to some kind of a resolution, mutually accepted resolution. He was refusing to come. So we said to her, you have a point. You're not trying to blackmail, you're not trying to control him. You're trying to just get him to have a normal discussion and to show some responsibility towards his kids. So the husband wasn't willing to do it, and he was getting married overseas. So he went overseas to a European country. He kept on calling us, no, what's happening with the get? So I told him, I said, listen, very simple. She's asking you to have a discussion with her and to come to some resolution about, you're not taking any responsibility. at least sit down with her. If you show goodwill and you're going to sit down with her, then we'll try to facilitate again. But if you're not even willing to talk to her, she has a very good point. Anyway, the wedding is getting closer. It came to a point literally a few days before the chasna, before the wedding, that the rabbi of the city called me up, and he says, Rabbi, what do we do? He ordered the band, he ordered the catering, everything is happening. Why isn't he, can he get married or not? So I explained to him the situation. I said to him that the Beth will not give a get in such a case because he's refusing to cooperate. And the wedding didn't take place. He came back to Sydney and he sat down with her. And 2 weeks later, they came to a mutual agreement and she came to accept the get. So in such a case, even though technically she initiated the civil divorce, and we could have said, listen, because she initiated the civil divorce, therefore she has to be forced to take a get, by Zikui, we didn't say that because she had a very legitimate request. There's another mechanism, a very complicated mechanism that exists only for men, not for women. And that was established by Rabbi Gershon himself, the same rabbi who stopped bigamy and polygamy. He gave one particular solution for men who have an impossible situation. The wife disappeared, for example. Or she will not take a get. Pure revenge, nothing logical. You can't appease her with anything, you can't discuss anything with her. Then there is a process called Heter Mei Rabbonim, which means a permission of 100 rabbis. That's how difficult he made it. And it's a process, it's not simple. We had 2.5 such cases in the years that I'm in the Beth Din. Why 2.5? Because 2 cases actually went through, and one of them, the wife came and accepted the get last minute. What happened in all of the 3 cases, there was no discussion. The wives, they literally wanted to extort the husbands. They already took them to court. The courts already ruled on a particular settlement, and they continued to use a get as a tool to be able to get more money out of them without any justification. There was no, they themselves went to court hoping for a better outcome, and they got a generous settlement, but they wanted more. In such a case, we started a process called Heter Mei Rabbonim, which means we had to write a formal ruling, a learned case, why this case deserves it. And all 3 rabbis from the Beth Din had to sign it. It had to be co-signed by a world-famous Beth Din, like a high court in Jerusalem. And after this co-signature, we had to get from 3 continents 100 rabbis to sign with us to agree to free that man. And that's how difficult it is for. So even though it's true that because there's a biblical reality, halachic reality, there's a certain difference in status between marriage for women and for men, but ultimately for men also it's not so simple, and also requires a process in order to be able to free them. But ultimately the bottom line is that we shouldn't tolerate any kind of control and extortion. I'm going to finish with the latest case that we had, and then we'll have some questions. This was a very recent case. We had a woman that came to see me about a year ago, and she says that she was married under a chuppah, Orthodox. Here in Sydney, almost everybody marries Orthodox. It's not like in America. In South Africa, in England, the majority, unless they can't be married for halachic reasons, unless the law doesn't allow them to get married, then they'll go to reform. But most people get married Orthodox. And all the marriages to go through the Sydney Beth Din to be approved and so on and so forth, as we mentioned before. So this woman comes along and she says that the husband will not give her a get. They're going through they have a civil divorce already. They're going through a property settlement. He knows she comes from a wealthy family. Whether she herself is wealthy, that's a different story, but she comes from a wealthy family, and he's hoping to get a very, very big settlement from her, and he's not giving her a divorce. And the court case can go for another 10 years. So we try to call him ourselves. We also had somebody from the community who knows him try to call this particular person. He basically hung up and he said, I will never give her a get, I'm not interested. He was quite rude and quite arrogant, but he showed that he's not interested at all, and he would hang up the phone every time. So I saw that it's not going to happen in normal way. So I asked her who was the rabbi who conducted a wedding. When she told me the name, obviously I will not give a name in this forum, I knew that she has some hope, because he's the only rabbi who, even though officially is Orthodox, he decided to remove himself from any Orthodox establishment, and he does what he wants basically. And I know for a fact that he usually doesn't have kosher witnesses. So I said to her, can you show me who were the witnesses? She brought me the ksuba, the marriage document. She asked her for photos and also a video. She brought me a DVD from the wedding. It was a small, intimate ceremony. Now you have to understand that to nullify a Orthodox wedding is very difficult. It's even harder, much harder than finding a solution for Mamzer. For Mamzer, every time that we found a solution, a tshuva, a learned responsum had to be written, like a thesis. And I would always, depending on how difficult and controversial the case is, I would have at least two rabbis, two respected scholars to co-sign with me, and sometimes more than that. But to be able to allow a woman to marry without a get, that's very unusual, and it's very, very difficult, because that's something which is irresponsible unless done properly. So in this particular case, I've done literally, it was 8 months took of research, and I wrote a very long tshuva, a ruling which was about over 10 pages long, and even that was short compared to what you could have written about the subject. And I've studied apart from the witnesses that actually were appointed to be under the chuppah, I studied every single other person that came to that particular ceremony. Because according to some opinions, even if you appoint non-kosher witnesses, but if you have kosher witnesses in the crowd, it also could be a problem with allowing a woman without a get. And we didn't just disqualify them, we actually had testimony based on every single one of them. It wasn't so many, because the vast majority of people attending were either women or relatives or non-Jews. And according to Jewish law, it has to be Jewish religious males in order to be kosher witnesses. And except for the rabbi, there wasn't one single other religious male present. When we finished, the case started in February last year, and we completed it I completed my ruling on the 8th, in October, which was something like 10 months later or 9 months later. And when we completed, then I wanted to have a lot of great scholars to agree with me. And I had maybe 8, 9 rabbis, including the chief rabbi of Israel, who also co-signed with me that he agrees that this particular chuppah was not valid because there was no two kosher witnesses at all, nowhere in that particular, and all of the mechanisms used to disqualify them very thorough. When we finished, I told the woman that I'm not going to give her the permission yet until now that we have this particular document permitting her to remarry, I'm going to call her husband to see if he'll give her a get, because he still have to try to get a get. So I called him up and I explained to him that she's getting this permission very shortly that the wedding is disqualified, and therefore she'll be able to remarry. But now he will be in a disadvantaged position, because the way we look at it like this: ideally there should always be a get. We always try to have a get. And if one person is trying to deny the get from his spouse, and we're able to find a solution for the spouse, then the one that denied her will not be able to get married until we give her a get. So now the shoe's on the other foot, so to speak. Now he'll be disadvantaged. When he heard that, he was very, very angry. He started to accuse us of all kinds of things. He said the whole thing's corrupt. She must have paid everybody off, and it's impossible. He was basically very angry because he was losing his grip on it. Until now he thought that he has control and will be able finally to get something out of the whole settlement. So he said, that he wasn't properly asked. Maybe he would have given a get. So I said to him, very good. If we made a mistake and you were always planning to give a get, we'll apologize. and all you have to do is give her a get, and that's it. And we'll take back everything we said that you're denying her a get. Just give her a get, and that's all. So he refused. He said he'll go to court, he'll go here and there. So we wrote him a letter telling him that exactly what's happening, and we told him there's 21 days to respond, but he can't respond himself. He has to be able to respond, to find some kind of a halachic authority who doesn't agree with our conclusion. And after 21 days, if he doesn't respond, then the permission for his wife to remarry will go through, but he will not be able to remarry unless he will give her a get. And that's how it remains. She got a permission. And we see over here, to sum everything that I've spoken about it, number one, the sanctity and the holiness of Jewish marriage is something very special. We believe that it's not just a ceremony, it's not a symbolic act. It can be copied by any kind of a marriage celebrant or any kind of ceremony that resembles the chuppah. It's a very, very special process. At the same time, it has to be treated in such a way. And we don't tolerate using the laws of our Holy Torah to be able to abuse and to be able to extort power and any kind of a whether it's revenge or extortion or blackmail or any other type of wrongful power over the other person. And ultimately, usually in most cases, we're able to succeed to find the solution for both parties. So now, if anybody has a question.
Okay, so we're going to start with some questions that already came in. Before we start with the questions, I just want to make a quick announcement. I just posted a link. If you can please fill out this form, it'll take literally 20 seconds. And this way we can stay in touch with you to notify you about all of Rabbi Ulman's classes that will be coming up. That would be greatly appreciated. Okay, so we're going to start with our first question. If a child was born in a relationship that was a non-Orthodox marriage, does it affect the status of the child?
Right. It doesn't. It doesn't affect it in a halachic way. Obviously, we do believe that a kosher halachic marriage brings the children in a state of holiness, and it sort of gives certain extra spiritual blessings to the child. And we always encourage those parents that didn't do it yet. It's never too late to be able to get married halachically, but in no way that if that's the only problem, that there was no chuppah and the couple got married either civilly or any other ceremony which is not halachic, the child is totally kosher and is able to marry anybody that he wants, unless there's another problem that we spoke about in the past.
I heard in a lecture that after Jews entered the land of Israel, having two wives was actually already forbidden. Is this true?
Not exactly. When they came to Israel, it was still practiced. There were certain limitations on it, and even kings who could afford to have many wives, they also limited how many wives they could have. It's interesting that already quite a number of generations before Rabbeinu Gershon came out in the 11th century with that chayrim, with that particular legislation against bigamy and polygamy, you can see already, as I mentioned before, that was very, very uncommon to have more than one wife. After he came out with this particular legislation, and I think that's what the one who asked the question, he may be mixing it up with. Even though in Israel, the Sephardi community wasn't prohibited from marrying more than one wife, but it wasn't practiced. And the general custom was not to take more than one wife in Israel all those years. And as a matter of fact, even for the Sephardi community, they used to sign on the ksuba, on the marriage document, that they're promising not to marry more than one wife. And so even though the chayrim didn't strictly apply to them, but it was definitely frowned upon and not practiced, but on a later stage, not in the very beginning when they came to Israel back 3,000 years ago, but more in the later years.
Okay, so this question is on the last story that you said with the Orthodox rabbi being the only witness at the chuppah. So they're asking, was their marriage never real, and does it mean that they were living in sin?
100%. They weren't married according to Jewish law. Because once it wasn't their fault, so it wouldn't be held against them from that perspective. But if we make sure that the rabbis go through courses how to officiate at properly halachic marriages with all of the requirements taken care of, because there's so many different laws, and if the rabbi just goes through the basic ceremony without studying all the laws, which include laws of who is a kosher witness, then his marriage that he performed is invalid. So yes, they were not married, correct.
Okay. So someone was born out of wedlock where the father is a Kohen and the mother is 100% Jewish. Is the child of that union a Kohen?
People asking very good questions. I'm very impressed. It's actually discussed very much. If the father is known, in other words, we know who the father is, a part of his life, the child is a Kohen, even though they didn't have a proper chuppah, correct? And yes.
Okay. Unfortunately, most Russian Jews did not have a chuppah, but a civil ceremony. What are their halachic ramifications for the children born out of that union?
Yeah, I've answered this before, but I think it's important to reiterate because we have a very large Russian community here. I've encouraged over the years hundreds of couples who married civilly in Russia to have a chuppah once they came to Australia, and they were claiming the roots and the heritage. Again, it's something which is very praiseworthy and it's very important to do. It doesn't in any way affect the kosher status of the children.
All right, I believe this is the final question. In the three cases of heter mea rabbanim, did the husband initiate the civil divorces in those cases?
You're asking a complicated. I have to remember. I don't remember all the details right now. It's a good question. I don't remember in all three cases who initiated. At the end of the day, everybody agreed that the marriage fell apart irrevocably and irreversibly. And again, there was nothing. The common grounds between all the three cases was that there was nothing that we could offer the wife as any. In other words, there's nothing that she wanted in order to give a get. We're asking her, is there anything that you want, anything that you would make you happy to give a get? But we didn't ask her to name a price or to start blackmailing him, but we thought maybe she feels that some wrong was done to her and she wants the wrong to be corrected. But in all the three cases, it was basically, that's why the exceptions to the rule, because usually we can negotiate a get, but in this case it was completely just for the sake of either revenge or extortion, one of the two.
I have another really good question that just came in. If the child is born from the original husband, but after the lady had an affair with another man, is the child a Mamzer?
Oh, that's a very good question also. Okay. So, I'll give a background to the question. A woman is married under chuppah. She has an affair with another man. And she has a child from her original husband to whom she's married. The answer is the child is kosher. It's very, very interesting that the biblical law says that a woman who commits adultery, she's asur labal, asur laboil. She's forbidden to her husband and forbidden to the man she had an affair with. So basically, she technically has to divorce her husband, and she can't marry the man that she had an affair with. That's the actual law, but the actual application of the law is more complicated, because the rabbis had made certain limitations what level of proof you have to have in order to be able to make a forbidden to her husband. Because what could happen, and what did happen many times, that a woman who wanted a divorce from her husband, she would come along and say I had an affair, and that would give her an automatic divorce. So therefore, there's a level of proof that is needed. So not every woman that comes along and says I had an affair automatically is forced, the husband is forced to divorce her. But even in a situation where we know for sure she had an affair, an open affair, for example, and we know for sure she's forbidden to her husband, without any question. It's a biblical prohibition, but as you know from last week, it's only an Isur Lav. It's on a level of a negative commandment. It's not on a level of arayos, of these illicit relationships that make a child a mamzer. I'm talking about now when she has a husband from a husband, not from the one that she had an affair with. And therefore, if the child was born from the husband, he is not a mamzer and is kosher to marry anybody. Thank you very much, everybody. It was a pleasure to talk to you and to have your company. And anybody, we have some questions coming up to me privately afterwards, I must say. So anybody has questions, you can still ask even after this forum. All the very best.